Hi again, everyone. Patrick Pfingsten here. I write the Illinoize political newsletter at the Illinoize, ILLINOIZE.com. Welcome to our weekly, semi-weekly-ish political podcast. Coming up on the show today, we'll welcome State Senator Chapin Rose, a Republican from Mahomet in the Champaign area. He focuses on a lot of financial issues for Senate Republicans. He's their chief budget negotiator. We'll talk a little bit about the new IDES report, audit that shows the state lost $5 billion in fraudulent claims, unemployment claims during the pandemic. We'll also talk about the new AFSCME contract, as well as some political questions too regarding the preparation of Senate Republicans for the 2024 election. We've reported over the last couple of weeks on Republican fundraising numbers that have essentially been abysmal. Is that spelling doom for Republicans in Illinois in 2024? We'll talk to Collin Corbett. He's a Republican strategist. We're recording this Friday. We actually sat down on his Smoke-Filled Room podcast on Thursday. So we recorded a segment with him while we were at a cigar lounge in Schaumburg to do that show on Thursday. So we'll have that for you coming up a little bit later on. First, though, a couple of words about the unemployment audit that came out from IDES. The reality here is that during the pandemic, especially the early days of the pandemic, businesses closed, offices shut down, people got furloughed, and there were a pile of claims into the state's unemployment system, the Illinois Department of Unemployment Security system, and the reality was, one, the state was completely overwhelmed by the huge increase in claims overnight, and two, in an effort to push those payments out to people so that they could pay rent and put food on the table, they bypassed some security checks, identity checks, and things like that, and it led to a lot of fraud to the point that $2+ billion out of the state's regular unemployment insurance program, and another $3.5 billion or so out of the pandemic unemployment assistance program that was federal money, all got taken from the state in fraud or mismanagement or identity theft. And the state's not going to get all that money back. Clearly, they've recovered about $500 million of it so far. There's no real telling what the state's doing to get that money back at this point. Essentially, we've been kind of met with a shrug, especially because most of the money was federal. It's a real slap in the face to see kind of the disregard that the governor's office has shown for this, at least publicly. There's been no real, yeah, we screwed up. There's been no real, yeah, we're going to fix it in case something like this ever happens again, which is really frustrating. If you look at it, things went to hell in a hula hoop, right? In those first few days after, first few months after the pandemic really hit us in early 2020. And yeah, there was a lot of desire to help people very quickly, but there was also a lot of negligence here too, especially the fact that some $40 million got sent to incarcerated people, prisoners, people who were in prison. Another $6 million was sent to dead people, that we know of. So it was a real slap to read some of those findings from the Auditor General, and we'll talk to Senator Rose about that coming up, and some political discussion as well. We've seen that. Remember, there are no statewide races in Illinois in 2024, other than, of course, a presidential race. at the top of the ticket. So the question is, what is that impact going to have on legislative races? And I think that comes down a lot to money. And we've seen that 7 House Republicans that represent districts that Joe Biden won in 2020 are grossly unprepared for 2024. They hardly raised any money. They don't seem to have any momentum on the ground. There are some, like maybe the House Democrats' top target is Representative Kevin Schmidt from Millstadt down by East St. Louis. He upset Representative LaToya Greenwood last year in what was the traditional East St. Louis district, and the House Democrats are going to go hard after him next year. And how much money did Schmidt raise in the second quarter of 2023? $0. So Republicans are facing another really difficult situation in 2024 when their incumbents aren't raising money, especially in difficult districts. And you're probably looking at Donald Trump at the top of the ticket, who's already lost Illinois by 1 million votes twice. You have to wonder just how bad the situation could get for House Republicans in 2024. All right, let's bring in State Senator Chapin Rose, a Republican from Mahomet, one of the top Republicans in the state budget negotiations, and an expert on a lot of the state financial issues. And I know that there's a lot of things that have been going on in state finances, and we wanted to bring the senator on for his perspective. So, Senator, let's start with this IDES audit, the Department of Employment Security audit that came out this week. The reality here is that during the pandemic, the agency was forced with a choice, I guess, at least as they present it, with let's get this money in people's hands as fast as humanly possible in the midst of a pandemic, and in that regard, they also bypassed some security issues. When you look at this audit and see where that money comes from, what IDES did during the pandemic, what was your reaction to it?
Yeah, first of all, let's give the scale and context here. You're talking about over $5 billion in money that just went missing, and the governor's excuse, such as it is, if you're going to give it any credence, you give it credence for the first couple months. But that's not what this audit did. And I think that's important to understand. The audit that I ordered was the entirety of the program, which lasted, as you know, COVID was more than just a couple months. This went on and went on and went on. And at the same time that other states were, closing the door on fraudulent activity, the same time the federal government was issuing guidance on best practices for prevention of cybercrime, cyber theft, these guys left the door wide open. I mean, that was one of the key findings in the audit, is that they outright ignored, the guidance given to them from the federal, from our federal partners on how to stop this very thing from happening. And so while, yeah, he can kind of point to, well, other states lost money too. Yeah, but they didn't leave their door open as long as you guys did to be robbed blind. And I think that's an important point here. I mean, we can all agree that in the early months of COVID, yeah, people were sucking, water out of a fire hose. But as time went on, to not, tailor your response, take on these critical events of protecting, from fraudulent activity. And it was really just, not just, this goes beyond just negligence. I mean, this goes beyond just gross negligence. This was reckless. And I want to say one other thing too. This isn't Johnny come lately with an audit after the fact. Myself, countless members of my side of the aisle, and I want to point out numerous Democrats told IDS, told senior governor staff, told the governor himself. I mean, I was in a conference call when Greg Harris, the then Democrat majority leader of the House, was saying, hey, there's a problem here. And why did we know that? We knew that because we have senior citizens calling our legislative offices saying, hey, I just got a unemployment debit card in the mail. I've been retired for 20 years. what is this? And so, the legislators were on the front lines. We certainly knew this was going on. And this is where I think the rubber really meets the road with the irritation on this. And one of the main reasons I ordered this audit is because every time we'd ask questions, every time to point out politely, hey, governor, this isn't working, something's wrong here. We get the, we know what we're doing. We've got it under control. You guys go away. Don't bother us with this. I mean, just sort of the arrogance of they knew what they were doing. Well, they knew what they were doing right to the point where they let $5 billion walk out the door. I mean, this was highway robbery. And so I'm not impressed with his excuse that, oh, well, this happened in California and New York too. I don't care about California and New York. You guys were given the federal guidance. You were given opportunities. And again, look, I realize fraud's fraud. You're not going to be able to stop all of it, but they were given opportunities to try to, shut the door, or at least get it a little bit closer, in terms of limiting the ability of these people to come in and attack us and steal this money. And it was, like I said, this is negligence. This is like reckless conduct. I mean, billions gone.
It is true that other states had the issue. I mean, I had claims made under my name in Michigan and Hawaii, two states that I've never lived and have never worked in. Never even been to Hawaii. We should change that. But the reality was these things got fixed. Both of them got fixed very quickly. And another part here is that
what do you mean got fixed?
Well, they got cleaned up. I mean, I wasn't held responsible. They got it. The other states got it cleaned up quickly.
I thought you were saying they got fixed here because this was ongoing for the first year and a half, and I think that's really it. I mean,
I think the point is that while other states seem to get their house in order relatively quickly, it seemed like we couldn't do that here.
Correct.
And the audit didn't necessarily say why, but do you have any understanding as to why?
Well, look, I just think it's part and parcel of the J.B. Pritzker administration that, I mean, everywhere you look, the trains don't run on time, right? And again, and I want to be very clear, Patrick, the first couple of months of COVID, everybody understood, right? I mean, we know that government services as they weren't going to be able to be delivered in the same way those first couple months, right? But after the first couple months, you should have started getting your sea legs on, right? It's the same problem I have with, for example, the COVID shot distributions, okay? They had 9 months to prepare for what was eventually going to happen. I mean, you knew eventually someday the vaccinations were going to be available, all right? And I'm not getting into whether you want them or don't want them. I'm just saying that eventually they're going to be available, and some amount of Illinoisans were going to want them, and that some amount was probably going to be in the nursing homes, right, in our nursing home settings. They waited basically till the COVID vaccines got here to even begin to plan how to distribute them, okay? That's just gross negligence, and I got plenty of examples of that too if you want to talk about it. But again, it's like they just sat there and stared at the problem and let it hit them over the head. The federal government was giving them, hey, here are protocols that you can put in place. Again, not to completely stop all theft, all fraud, but to significantly deter it. Close that door as much as you can to the opportunity for thieves. And instead, we just left the door wide open. Well, I didn't. I mean, everybody from me to Greg Harris was telling them there was a problem. And instead of listening and doing something, they just left the door open and let us be the subject of highway robbery. $5 billion gone.
Roughly $3.5 billion of that was the pandemic unemployment assistance, which was a federal program, federal dollars specifically. It seems, and I'm simplifying this statement, so there will be people who disagree with it, and that's fine. But essentially, the state's response to those losses has been, well, it's federal money. And that doesn't
do Illinoisans
seem to
not
make
pay
it
federal
okay.
taxes? Do Illinoisans not pay federal taxes? I mean, it's tax money any way you look at it, and they let us get robbed blind. And also remember this, that the trust fund went upside down, and that forced a quote unquote fix to backfill the trust fund, and the fix was to decrease the payout of future employees who would lose their jobs and to increase the payroll tax on employers for the trust fund. So future people who lose their jobs are going to get less benefit because of this, because of this, I started to say benign neglect, but it was so grossly negligent that it was horrific. Benign neglect involves like some level of care. It was almost like they didn't even care. But, future employees are going to get hurt by this. And frankly, everybody's like, well, employers pay tax. No, to the extent that employers pay the tax, that's coming out of a pay raise for an employee, that's coming out of hiring other employees. So the people of Illinois, at the end of the day, this level of highway robbery, $5+ billion is just whacking us upside the head with trying to clean up, Governor Pritzker's mess.
So they've recovered roughly $500 million of that, but you're not going to hold identity theft victims, for responsible for people who had money stolen from them. Is there any recourse otherwise to get any of this money back?
Yeah, let me say this, and I'm speculating here, but I would suspect that of the kind of less than 10% that they've recovered, I would say that's less the governor's recovery as it was those little ladies who called all the legislators' offices and said, "Hey, I retired 20 years ago. Why did I get a debit card in the mail?" Right? And so once we help them, and not just our office, but all across the state, once we help those folks, basically, cancel their accounts, then that would allow the clawback of those funds. So I'm speculating, but again, to the extent they've recovered what they say is less than 10%, I bet it's actually, frankly, not them doing anything as much as it was good citizens doing their civic duty to call in and say, "Hey, this isn't me. I shouldn't get these dollars." Now let's talk about where we go from here, because that's the next thing. One, I want to know, what is the recovery effort? What has Kwame Raoul done to try to get us our money back? And there was, it's high, it's all cybercrime. We'll never catch them. It's the Nigerian mafia or whatever, right? You hear about this sophistication, nation state actors, blah, blah, blah. Well, let's just take the $40 million that went to Illinois Department of Corrections and, prisoners, right? About $40 million went to fraudulent activity in the name of people who are incarcerated. Well, first of all, Governor Pritzker, you're the governor of the Department of Corrections as well. You guys could have easily cross-referenced the applicant list against the prisoner list and realized that these people couldn't file claims, but you didn't do that. So there's $40 million there. Well, that $40 million went to an address. Those debit cards were mailed to an address, right, Patrick? Have we gone to that address? Have we said to whoever answers the door, "Hey, we see that, this debit card was mailed here and in the name of Joe Smith, and Joe was at the Department of Corrections at Joliet. And so did you see the debit card? Well, what happened to the debit card? And more importantly, did we pull the swipes?" Because once you look at the swipes on the debit card, you can say, "Hey, Walmart, we're going to send you a subpoena for your security cam footage. And we're going to look at the security cam footage. And lo and behold, if that isn't John Smith's sister, who knew damn good and well that John Smith was at Joliet Correctional Institution, applied for the funds in John Smith's name, and then spent the money," right? So the real question here and is, what, if any, actual investigation has been done to try to prosecute these people, try to recoup these dollars? And yeah, I get the fact that it's easy for people like Kwame Raoul, the Attorney General, and the governor to say, "Well, the FBI is investigating it. We're just going to let them do their thing." But in a very real sense, look, I used to be a prosecutor. You've got swipes and you've got addresses. Okay? Those are two investigatory leads that could take you very far. And I'll tell you, one time, just in my own private law practice, we were able to subpoena the security cam footage on a civil case on behalf of a credit card issuer to find out who was fraudulently using the swipes, because we said, "Hey, we know that this card was swiped at this Walmart on this date at this time. And frankly, you can even get down to this aisle, this checkout aisle, and here's the security cam footage." And we were able to, find out some very important things just from that information. Now, I'm not a prosecutor anymore, but Kwame Raoul is. He's the chief law enforcement officer of the state of Illinois. So what investigation is actually being done to get the people of Illinois at least some of their money back. Look, $5 billion due to JB's complete mismanagement and gross negligence. We're never going to get $5 billion back, but can we do better than we've done? I think we could.
Let's move to the new AFSCME contract for a minute, if we can, Senator. You and other Republicans in the waning hours of the legislative session complained that while the governor's office was in contract negotiations with AFSCME, that there wasn't money budgeted for a new contract in the new fiscal year. We find out AFSCME employees will get a 4% raise retroactive to July 1st, another 2.5% at the beginning of 2024, a $1,200 stipend that will go to thousands of these employees. The governor's office is saying it's a $200 million cost this year, and $600 over the 3 years. We can only take them at their word. We don't have the actual figures at this point, but I guess the question here is, you have to have state employees. There are jobs to be done. Is this a contract the state can afford?
Yeah. So I think this is, look, let's revisit kind of the budget process, right? The Senate voted first, I believe, in the early evening, and then the House voted, the next day at some point. We'd asked in the committee, and this is
it actually ended up being a few days later this year.
Yeah, a few days later
because of
So we'd asked in committee in the Senate, and I can't speak to the House committee, but in the Senate committee, which, by the way, the budget that ultimately passed wasn't available for review in our committee. They filed it, frankly, I think they filed one of the budget bills in the middle of the committee while we were all sitting there, but we'd already been discussing, quote unquote, the budget that wasn't even filed. So one of the questions I asked is like, hey, how much is in here? How have you accounted for that? And again, it's important across everything from, Secretary of State's office, and, are they going to be able to keep the hours they've got? Are they not going to be keep the hours they've got? And you saw that the secretary has just done some changes in office hours that he's working on, all the way down to, things like the, DNR and ag and all the different state agencies, right? So have you appropriately accounted for those? Because if you haven't accounted for the increases, you're going to have to cut something, or you're going to have to come back and ask for a supplemental later. And at that point in time, the AFSCME contract was not final. It had not been signed. It was still being negotiated. And so, even though in our committee, I think the Senate Democrats at that time were honest in my memory when they're saying, well, we think we have, but we're not really sure because it hasn't been completed yet, and we'll get back to you, right? It was kind of their answer. And then, later on, after it passes the Senate, the governor says, yeah, it's been accounted for. Well, it hadn't even been signed yet. I mean, the deal hadn't been done. So no matter who you're talking about, they were shooting at sort of a moving target because they were still in active negotiations. And so I just simply point this out, that it's going to be interesting to see how, from, now that we're into the next fiscal year, how this really is going to impact our budget, for the next 11 months here, now that we're almost done with the first month of the fiscal year, because all those agencies, if they come up short, they're either going to have to come up with a supplemental, or they're going to have to cut something else. And, places like DOC, I mean, there's a big one. I mean, DOC is a huge payroll component to the Department of Corrections. And, if they can't onboard, I mean, it's almost can get out of control. If you can't onboard new officers at the regular pay rate, then you've got to do overtime for the existing officers. So, when you don't know the number you're shooting at, when you're doing the budget, and again, think about the time that lapsed here. We passed the budget in early May, something like that?
Late May.
That's right. We had to come back. You're right. We came back. So late May. It wasn't for another 6 weeks before this deal got finalized, and they're telling us, oh, don't worry about it. I'll bet you somewhere around next January there's a supplemental, and I'll bet you that supplemental shores up the numbers that this AFSCME contract increase,
Well, where are they going to find the money in a supplemental? I mean, I think that's the question, is that all indicators show that revenue is slowing down.
Well, remember, they socked away $1 billion in the so-called rainy day fund, right? $1 billion plus something at this point. I don't remember the exact number, but they've got money in that fund. So
Susanna Mendoza may be holding over that with a cast iron pan and a sword, saying stay away from there.
Right. Well, that's the big problem, right? When you're shooting at a target, and look, it's not like people didn't ask. I mean, we asked in committee hearings, we asked behind the scenes, we asked extensively, where is this contract going to land? And no one could ever give us a concrete number. Well, of course they couldn't, because it didn't get signed for 6 weeks. But now that it's here, it is going to have to be accounted for. And as you pointed out, the revenues are starting to decline. The governor's built himself a little bit of cushion, but let's be clear that cushion exists because of the federal Biden bucks that came in during COVID, right? Prior to that, you had the governor running around telling everybody we needed a brand new tax increase or the sky was going to fall. Remember that, Patrick? So, Chicken Little was telling the whole state of Illinois that if we didn't vote for the progressive income tax, everything under the sun was going to collapse. But he got bailed out. And I guess my only point in saying this is Governor Pritzker's budget got lucky based upon a horrific occurrence called COVID. If he starts going back to the same spending, the same out of control spending spree that his predecessors have been on, that bailout ain't going to last very long. And, and some of that will be measured upon how the economy does or doesn't do here in the next year, next couple of years. But I can easily foresee us in a situation where we're right back in the hole here shortly.
Before we let you go, Senator, a political question. We reported this week that there are concerns within your caucus, the Senate Republicans, that you all are essentially unprepared for the 2024 cycle. You don't have really any seats to defend. The 4 Republicans that are up next year are all safe Republican seats, but there are 2 or 3 Democratic seats that are seen as potential pickups. But the caucus essentially, hasn't been organized. The campaign arm hasn't been organized. There's not a lot of money being raised. Are Republicans ready to be in the game for 2024?
Well, look, we got a new leader. I support our new leader. He's getting his sea legs on. I can tell you that, but he's a quick study. And he's out this summer doing all the things that need to be done to be prepared for 2024. I'm also going to say this, there's this notion that somehow it's all about the caucus political arm. Well, Governor Egger told me a long time ago that fundraising, volunteer support, all the things that you need to be successful in politics, follow the candidate. Okay. Good candidates will bring those things with them. And so, I think what Leader Kern is doing is the right thing. Is he's focusing on, candidate recruitment and making sure we're first and foremost, putting vetted, responsible, solid candidates out in these races so that, we can go make the case, to not just the local voters, but also, volunteers and others to, make the appropriate investments in those candidates to get them across the finish line. Again, I've been through enough leader changes that in the first 6 months of any new leader, that's the same complaint for all of them. Okay. But by the time you get to summer, they start getting the sea legs on, they get out in the field, they start, visiting with, donors, small and large, they start visiting with, national folks. And most importantly, again, money, resources, volunteers follow good candidates. It's candidate recruitment. And that's where Leader Kern's at. And I'll do everything I can to help him be successful.
State Senator Chapin Rose, Republican from Mahomet. The senator and I go way back to like 2004 or 5. So, Senator, a pleasure as always. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure, Patrick. Have a great day.
All right. Thanks to Senator Rose for taking a few minutes to sit down with us on Friday and talk through some of these issues. We'll share with you our conversation with Collin Corbett next. Again, this is a little different setting. We clicked the cameras on to record a segment before we taped his Smoke-Filled Room podcast at a cigar lounge in Schaumburg on Thursday. So here's our conversation. Collin runs the Core Strategies political consulting group, Republican consultant. Collin, we've had a lot of stories over the last couple of weeks about fundraising and the general electoral situation for Republicans in this state leading into the 2024 election cycle. I can't help but think that it's anything but bad. So from a Republican perspective, how do you sell to potential candidates, to voters, et cetera, that you guys aren't in terrible shape for 24?
Well, first I'll start with, I'm a pragmatist, not a optimist. So you've asked for half the equation, and I will happily give you half the equation. But if someone asked me how are Republicans going to do next year, I wouldn't give you this rosy of a response. So I'll start with that. But the question is, what are those chances of optimism? What could look good for us? There are some key signs. First of all, the Democratic Party is lurching further and further leftward as they bow to the far left of their party, the progressive wing of their party. And Madigan and some of the powers that be in this state did a really good job of keeping the party as more of a centrist working class party. With Madigan out of power, you're seeing that the left is pulling the Democratic Party in Illinois further and further leftward, and that's going to create opportunities for the Republican Party. It already has, and it will create even more. The second thing I'd point to is I saw in the numbers you reported something that was fascinating, which was a lot of the numbers for individual Democrats were actually pretty abysmal. Yes, they have huge amount of money in Harmon's bank account, in less so, but in Welch's bank account, in Pritzker's unlimited bank account, and the unions can come in with massive checks. I get all that. But when you look at the individual fundraising numbers, both Republicans and Democrats are horrible at fundraising. And that doesn't give us much hope on the Republican side, but the good news is Pritzker's not going to be here forever. He has high ambitions. And I do see signs of some of the more working class unions open to talking to Republicans. We see it in Will County, Southern Cook. We see it in Sangamon County, where Republicans actually work with unions closely, and unions support Republican and conservative candidates. And so I see cracks in that armor where if Pritzker goes away and Republicans could actually start to woo unions and move past the Rauner hatred that they had, we could change that dynamic when it comes to fundraising.
See, Rauner did this with Republicans, where he took over the infrastructure and essentially funded everybody. Pritzker is sort of doing that now, but where Rauner went away and the Republican fundraising infrastructure crumbled, when Pritzker eventually goes away, whether it's not seeking a third term, whether it's whatever else he chooses to do, you still have unions to fill that hole. So why don't Republicans have a built-in fundraising network, whether it's through business or another sector? I mean, what has happened it's been 6 years since Bruce Rauner at this point, so why can't you guys build up a fundraising network?
Yeah, here's the good news. I've talked to a lot of business leaders in this state, and they're still here. But what you've got to understand about business leaders is that they're business leaders. They're going to make a evaluation of a situation and decide if it's worth an investment. This party, my party right now, is not worth a major investment from a business leader. I'll admit it. We all get it. But we could be. And I've talked to a lot of these business leaders, and they've said, we haven't gone anywhere. We're still here. But we're not dumb enough to go spend money on a bad investment. Show us your party's worth it, we'll start cutting checks again. And so if we can do the hard work of improving this party, becoming a brand that people would actually be willing to invest in, those checkbooks are still there. Those checks can still get cut. I talked to one of the biggest donors for Republicans who's given probably 7 figures in this state to Republicans over the last decade, and he hasn't given in a while. And he said, listen, I'll happily cut your checks again. Right now, I'm spending that money on nonprofits because I see more value to doing that right now. But I'll come back when you guys are ready for me. I believe that money is there as long as we can improve the party, and that's, of course, the if, right? We've got a lot of work to do, but the money hasn't gone away.
Your party looks well on its way to renominating a guy for president who lost Illinois by 1 million votes twice, is toxic to suburban voters, and is likely to drag down a bunch of legislative candidates, especially in the suburbs. Again, Richard Porter was in Real Clear Politics, or Roll Call, or wherever it was that he wrote this week, that the Republicans essentially need to move on from Trump. He's a DeSantis guy. Don't know what you see there either. But the idea here is that you're going to ask candidates to get into races where not only do they have a network problem with a built-in fundraising network problem, not being able to raise money. Democrats have all the money. You have a Republican brand, especially in the suburbs, that's toxic, and then you're going to have Trump dragging every Republican in the suburbs down too. That has to kill candidate recruitment. Am I right?
So here's what I'd say. Actually, I've got we're about to record our podcast, so our political team is in the room, and they're out recruiting. And I can tell you that compared to this time 2 and 4 years ago, recruitment is actually on an uptick. Where we were already moving on to tier 3 candidates by this point, because the tier 1s and the tier 2s kind of basically laughed at us. This time around, those conversations are a lot more fruitful. I'm not saying every time we're getting a tier 1, but I am saying that we are seeing more success on recruitment this time around than we have the last 2 to 3 cycles, and that to me is a heartening sign. I think people realize that yes, Trump is a factor, and if he's the nominee, he's going to hurt us in areas of the suburbs. We just did an analysis for one of our candidates that if Trump's at the top of the ticket, that's an 8 to 10 point swing in their district compared to if Trump is not at the top of the ticket. So I get it. I agree with what you're saying in certain areas of the state. But what we are seeing is that the voters are with us on issues. Sure, they don't like some of our personalities, and I get it. But on issues, when you take party out of it, more often than not, the voters are with us on the top 3 or 4 issues out there. Yes, there are a few social issues that maybe that we don't play as well with, but a lot of the kitchen table issues, the voters are with us, and these candidates that we're talking to, they get that. They understand that whether Trump's the nominee or not, he's not going to be the face of this party forever. They understand that there is a light at the end of the tunnel in places like the suburbs, and they're feeling very passionate about issues that they care about, and they see that those issues are resonating. There's going to be a challenge to try to avoid these races being nationalized in a general election, and that's something we're going to have to fight. But when the voters are with you, you at least have something that you can work with.
But let's be fair. I mean, the narrative here has made Republicans look like abortion is a major issue, that immigration is a major issue, that Republicans want to ban books and close libraries, and the Republican brand looks extreme. Whether you want to get into the nuance and fight on that, it's fine, but it's clear that there's the narrative there. How do you convince a suburban female voter, which has largely killed Republicans in this state in the last 3 or 4 cycles, how do you convince them that we're not as extreme as you think we are, or as the national media portrays us to be, and that these pocketbook issues that we're trying to show this bit of difference on are really the key here?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't confine it just to pocketbook issues, but I do get your point. The polling we did after the election in 2022 showed that the voters in this state are just as likely to think that Democrats are extreme as Republicans. And we teach when it comes to communications that a good defense is a good offense, or the best defense is a good offense. And so I think the challenge will be here not trying to prove that we're not extreme. Then you get into that Nixon thing of I'm not a crook. Really, it's proving the other side is extreme. And as I said, that as the party on the Democratic side moves further and further left, as Delia Ramirez and you hear even Chewy and a lot of these leaders that are left of center push their policies, I see it in the Hispanic community, where Hispanic turnout was the lowest we've seen in decades in this state in 2022 and in 2023. And so if you tell me that immigration is the hot button issue, then I'd say, well, where's the Hispanic turnout? You tell me that abortion is why Democrats won, I'd ask, then why did females stay home in 2022? I see that this is an issue really with perception of the parties, and Republicans haven't fought on this ground, but I believe that the other side is just as extreme, if not more extreme, than our party. We just don't fight. But the voters, when we ask them which party's more extreme, they tell us that, frankly, a pox on both your houses. We don't like either of you. And so if we engage on this ground, I think we can start to make some gains.
So before we let you go, I think it's worth mentioning that a lot of this, at least for general election candidates, comes down to Republican primary voters. Republican primary voters gave you Darren Bailey. Republican primary voters gave you Donald Trump, et cetera, et cetera. How do you, from whether it's your perspective in the trenches or your candidates, how do you change the mind of Republican primary voters who want the most conservative, most I don't think extreme is right in this instance, but
Pure, maybe?
Pure, I think, is probably the right, ideologically pure Republican candidate, the Darren Baileys of the world. How do you convince Republican primary voters that here's this candidate that agrees with you 85 to 90% of the time and can actually win, instead of this guy who agrees with you 100% of the time and is absolutely unelectable?
Yeah, this is one where I'm going to give you the summary answer because I could go way too long on. But the summary of the answer is this. Our party needs to stop talking to the analytical side of the minds of voters and start talking to the feeling side, because people take action on their emotions. They take action on their feelings. And we're in a generation now where people vote based on how they feel, not based on the facts or the information. So we spend so much time talking to these voters on that analytical side of, well, here's where this candidate stands on this issue or that issue. When in truth, people vote based on how they feel. They didn't vote for Richard Irvin because they didn't like the guy. They didn't like that he lied to them. They didn't like that some Chicago billionaire was telling them how to vote. And they liked how Darren Bailey made them feel. That's how people vote. Trump made them feel good, while the left talked down to them, while Hollywood and the big media and whatever else talked down to them. Donald Trump said, hey, I hear you, and stood up for the white working class, the high school educated voters. I mean, I think that what we see in politics and what we teach our candidates all the time is that voters act on how they feel. So when you run these campaigns, stop getting lost on these issues. I believe you run good candidates who can connect with the voters, and it's not going to matter if they're ideologically pure or if they're 85% or if they're 50%. If the voters like them, they're going to vote for them. But that's where we struggle, is on candidate quality and on campaign quality. Had Richard Irvin and his campaign team run a better campaign that didn't just lie to voters for 6 months, maybe he would have been the nominee. And so blaming that on primary voters, I think is partially accurate and partially unfair to primary voters. They didn't have a good candidate they could support, a candidate they could like. So they defaulted to the guy who was with them on most of the issues. Maybe if we go get an electable candidate, we might see things change.
All right, we'll leave it at that. Collin Corbett, Core Strategies, Smoke-Filled Room Podcast. Let's smoke a cigar.
I like it.
And thanks to Collin Corbett of Core Strategies for joining us. Their Smoke-Filled Room Podcast, which we'll link below. And appreciate him having us on that as well. And thanks to Senator Chapin Rose for taking time with us on the show as well. Thank you for joining us. A pleasure as always to talk politics and policy with you on this podcast on YouTube or on traditional podcast channels, wherever you may find it. We do appreciate you and all of our readers and listeners and those that join us at theillinoise.com to keep up on what's going on in our state. I'm Patrick Pfingsten. Thanks so much for joining us. Have a great day.